Good morning, everybody. My name is BJ Harvey. I'm an occupational therapy student, and I will be presenting today about the topic of mental health and how it can relate to chronic stroke. So, kind of looking forward today and some of the things that we're going to talk about. We're going to look at mental health in general, so what it is, defining mental health so that you guys can get a better understanding of that. We're going to look at the effect a stroke can have on your mental health, so both physically and mentally. We're going to talk about just a couple of common mental health disorders. So some things that you might see within the stroke population. We are going to look at the word stigma. So what is stigma? How do we combat stigma? And just generally getting an idea of what that is. And then towards the end, we're going to look into some techniques that you can use to help your own mental health, as well as how you can promote positive mental health for those around you. So, kind of just starting off, what is mental health? Mental health is defined as a state of mental well being. So, this can include psychological, emotional, and social well being. These are the three main aspects that we're going to kind of dive into to look at how these work dynamically to impact your mental health. The next thing we're going to look at is how does a stroke affect mental health? So obviously there's many different aspects that a stroke affects. Besides just the physical aspects, it also can impact mental aspects, social aspects, and kind of just impact the way that you interact with your environment. So the three main factors that I'm kind of going to look at and talk about today are physiological factors. So physiological meaning physical factors that are changes to the brain and changes to the body. So these are the two main things we see after stroke. We're also going to look at social factors. So social factors will be the way that a stroke can impact your relationships and ways that you interact socially with other individuals in your life. And finally, the last factor that we're really going to focus on today is personal factors. A stroke really changes a person. It can alter your personality, the way you live, your outlook on life. And these are some of the personal factors that we're really going to key in on today. So starting off with physiological changes. So these are some of the more objective things that we can really see and determine. Um, One of the main ones, obviously, is brain function. So after someone's had a stroke, there are changes that occur in the brain. These can be changes to brain matter, changes to areas of the brain, and also brain chemistry. Brain chemistry is a very, very important one because we have different neurotransmitters and different things in our brain that are important in regulating the way that the brain functions. So when someone has a stroke, these things sometimes might get out of balance, and this is something that can kind of lead to some issues and also can lead to mental health problems. This kind of ties in perfectly with emotional regulation. So being able to regulate your emotions is something that the brain really focuses on. And after a stroke, sometimes we see individuals may lose the ability to emotionally regulate, and this can be one of those things that also ties into mental health. Bodily function. So this is something a lot of you guys have seen, but people sometimes are hemiparetic after strokes, lose some function in the legs, lose function in their arms. You might lose sensation, so like your ability to feel, your ability to taste, smell, and a very, very important one is your ability to see. So some people end up having vision problems, and this is one of those physiological changes that we're talking about. And finally, just newly introduced limitations. Everybody that has a stroke or has had a stroke will undergo this at some point, but whether that's a limitation in your ability to walk independently, shower independently, cook your food, read, things like that. These are some of those newly introduced limitations that you're experiencing. And these physical changes can really take a toll on somebody's mental health. The next thing we're going to look at is social changes. I believe this one is very important because as humans, we're naturally social beings. And when you have a stroke, sometimes your sociality changes a little bit. So role changes. This means, maybe your role as a parent, your role as a husband, the way your role at work, things like that. These can all change after a stroke, and these can play an impact on someone's health. This kind of ties in with responsibility changes. So before the stroke, you might have been the primary caregiver of somebody. You might have been the breadwinner in the house. You might have been in charge of certain things that you may not be in charge of anymore because your stroke has impacted your ability to do this. And this ties into relationship dynamics. So your ability to kind of just the way you interact with those around you. So the way you interact with your family, your friends, people on the streets, things like this, these all change after a stroke. And then the last one I wanted to talk about was just generally social exposure. So I know after a stroke, some people might not be as social as they used to be. They might not go out as much. They might not hang out with their friends as much. They might not do all these social things that they used to do. And kind of isolating yourself can really take a toll on your mental health. Last but not least, we're going to talk about some personal changes. So these are things that are happening to you internally. And the first thing that I thought of was personality. So you see a lot of the times people will be a completely different person sometimes before and after their stroke. They might have been a super extroverted person and now they've had their stroke and they may be more introverted. They could have been very funny. They could have been this, they could have been that, but sometimes these things change. And this ties back to that brain function. But just changes in the brain can really change who a person is and how a person interacts. The next thing is the sense of autonomy. So, autonomy really just means that you're in control of your body, you're in control of what you do, you're in control of what you say, where you go, things like this. And sometimes this is impacted by a stroke, and you might feel like you're losing this sense of autonomy because you have to have help from somebody else or you need a caregiver, things like this. The next one, this is a occupational therapy term that we use quite a bit, but it's occupational participation. Really what this means is your ability to participate in activities that you find meaningful. So things that you may have done before, this could be hobbies, this could be golf, sewing, reading, you know, walking your dog, even things like cooking, cleaning, stuff like that. These are all occupations. And sometimes people might lose a little bit of this occupational participation because of their functional limitations that have happened because of stroke. Habits and routines also kind of tie into this. You may have always gone to church on Sundays at a certain time. You might have went golfing with your buddies on Saturdays. You may have walked your dog every morning at 6 a.m. Things like this change. And especially after stroke, you kind of have to adapt your habits and routines. And finally, one of the most important ones, I think, is your career. So a lot of people um, worked certain jobs, they had certain career paths, doctors, teachers, lawyers, things like that, engineers. And then once you have a stroke, sometimes you lose your ability to do these things. So this can really, really play an impact on your mental health, especially if it's something that you went to college for, or you might have spent a lot of time on this, and now it's something that you feel like you just can't do anymore because of some of the limitations that you might have. But after looking at all of these things, the main takeaway that I wanted you guys to get was all of these factors that I just mentioned play an impact on your mental health. They all kind of work together in unity to create positive mental health. And when there's things like a stroke that impact these, some stuff starts to kind of fall out of balance a little bit. And when there's imbalances in these factors, this can lead to poor mental health, which is kind of what we're talking about today. So next we're going to talk about the two most common mental health disorders specific to stroke survivors and chronic stroke. So the first one is depression, which I'm sure you guys have heard of before. And the next one is anxiety. So depression and anxiety are two very common mental health disorders to the general public, but also extremely common for individuals who have survived strokes. So we're going to talk a little bit more in depth about depression and kind of just what that looks like and maybe some signs and symptoms that you might see within yourself or within others around you. And it's also important to note that although you may be experiencing some of these signs, that doesn't necessarily mean you have depression, but it could just mean that, you may just be having a bad day or you may be having a bad week. There's objective like ways that people can diagnose these, and that'd be diagnosed by, like a clinical psychiatrist, psychologist, doctor, things like that. So if you see some of these up here and you know that you have these, it doesn't necessarily mean you have depression. It may just mean that you have some of the symptoms. So if you wanted to know if you have a diagnosis, that'd be something that you'd get diagnosed by a doctor. But some of these things are fatigue, so just generally being tired. Insomnia is a very big one, so an inability to sleep, which that's also just a byproduct of also having a stroke sometimes. Hygiene neglect, so you may not be able to keep up on your hygiene, or you may not feel like wanting to shower, you may not feel like wanting to look presentable, you may not want to brush your teeth. Loss of appetite is a big one. When you see individuals who are never hungry or just don't feel like eating, that can be a sign of depression. And I think the most important one and the biggest one, this one's sometimes kind of hard to talk about, is suicidal ideation. So you have individuals who have thought about suicide or are thinking about suicide. This is one of the main signs that you may have depression. And if you ever are feeling this, you need to talk to somebody because this is a very serious matter. And then next, we're going to look at anxiety and we're going to talk about some of these signs. And sort of like I mentioned earlier, you can be having signs of anxiety, but that does not always mean you have it. You could just be nervous. It's something that has a clinical diagnosis. You'd get diagnosed by a psychologist, psychiatrist, or a doctor. Um, but one of the main signs is you're always nervous. So we see this a lot in stroke. People are nervous to maybe fall or nervous to try and get out of bed on their own. They don't want to fall. People might be nervous to talk in front of large groups if they have something like aphasia. We see nervousness as one of the main signs of anxiety, and you can kind of see how it correlates with chronic stroke because of the way that it presents. Then there's hyperventilation. So hyperventilation is that kind of increased breathing rate, but it's also like short breaths. So kind of and when people hyperventilate a lot, this could also be signs of like a panic attack, which is down in the bottom left corner here. Panic attacks are a sign of anxiety. This kind of goes hand in hand with increased heart rate as well. So increased heart rate, hyperventilation, and panic attacks are all signs. Hyperfixating on problems is one that we see a lot, especially with stroke survivors. Um, they find one thing and they kind of just hyper focus on that, and they think that that problem is going to be, the end of the world. This is the biggest problem ever. How am I going to get over this? That's a huge sign of anxiety. And finally, just constant overthinking. Overthinking about little things that really don't matter in the broad scheme are signs of anxiety. So I see this in myself even sometimes, when I'm going to bed, I start thinking about maybe something I said or something I did. And then, an hour's pass by and I realize that I've been thinking about this problem for way too long when it really wasn't that big of a deal. So these kind of culminate together to create some signs of anxiety. And if you really think that you have all of these signs and symptoms, it might be something that you want to talk to somebody about and see if maybe you can get a clinical diagnosis of anxiety. So we just talked about, the two biggest or most prevalent mental health disorders, depression and anxiety, specifically within stroke survivors. So now we're going to talk a little bit about the word stigma. And this is kind of a word that has been being brought up more recently. I've kind of learned about more in the recent years. But it's very important when talking about mental health because mental health seems to carry a bit of a stigma around it when in reality it should not carry a stigma whatsoever. So kind of define it. Stigma is just a mark of disgrace associated with a particular circumstance. In this case, the circumstance is mental health. Mental health has a negative stigma. Um, Specifically, I feel like mental health has a stigma when it comes to our male population. Men tend to not want to talk about mental health. Um, Kind of in our culture, it's seen as a weakness, kind of taboo. You don't want to talk about it as much because you don't want to come off as weak. And it really shouldn't be a stigma at all. And I think for us to progress, we need to be more comfortable with talking about mental health as the years go on, because as you'll see on the next slide, it's a very, very big problem, especially within stroke survivors. So, 1 in 5 adults in the United States will be diagnosed with some form of mental illness within their lifetime. So that's 20%. So you look around, the people around here today, 20% will be diagnosed with some form of mental illness in their lifetime. When you look down a little bit, stroke survivors specifically, 1 in 3 will experience either post-stroke depression or post-stroke anxiety. So kind of like how we talked earlier about depression and anxiety, 1 in 3 people who have experienced a stroke will be diagnosed with one of those at some point in their lifetime. So 1/3, that's a pretty significant number if you look around and think about it. 1 in 3 people. So 3 people, ASF maybe. One of you guys may have depression or anxiety, or at least exhibit some signs of that. And finally, 75% of all stroke survivors will deal with some form of mental health challenges. 75% is a very big number. 3/4 of the people that survive strokes will deal with some signs, some depression, some anxiety, maybe some form of eating disorder, things like that. And this is really, really a big deal because there's such a stigma around it that we don't want to talk about it, but we really need to talk about it because the number is so large. So the final thing we're going to talk about is what can you do? So you might be at the point where, okay, I'm realizing I have some of these signs and symptoms of mental health issues, or sometimes, I'm having a really bad day, or sometimes I recognize that maybe my colleagues are having a bad day or might be exhibiting some of these signs. There are some things that you can do to try and help improve upon your mental health or even help others improve upon their mental health. And if you see it fit, you can help them get the help that they need from either like a clinical psychologist or some other form of resource. So these are all backed by science, things that you can do that have been shown to help improve mental health. And I'm going to talk about all of them. Exercise. This is a huge one, exercising not only is good for your physical fitness, but has really been shown to improve your mental health in the long run. This can be all sorts of types of exercise too. It can be cardio, walking, getting on the new step, riding a bike, things like that, dancing, stuff like that. Those are all cardio type exercises. And then you've got resistance training. So lifting weights, weights in the pool, doing stuff like that. And then there's other forms of exercise like yoga, hot yoga, stuff like that. All good for your mental health and all has been shown to improve mental health. And this kind of ties in with meditating. I know that here at ASF they do the mindfulness with ADA, but meditation has been shown to be very impactful in as being a coping strategy to improve upon your own mental health. Finding hobbies. I think this one is huge. As an occupational therapist, I also am inclined to say that participating in your enjoyed hobbies is crucial to your mental health. I understand that with chronic stroke and maybe some disabilities that come with that, you may not really be able to participate in the hobbies that you used to. But there are tons of things out there that you can try, and maybe try learning new hobbies will help improve your mental health. Another very important one is dietary changes. Eating a good diet is integral to having good mental health. If you're always eating poorly, fast food, drinking a lot of soda, energy drinks all the time, um, these are these are things that can have a negative impact on your mental health. And I forgot to list it, but kind of with that is also the idea of sleep. Sleep is extremely important. You should be getting 7 or 8 hours a night at least. If you're not getting that, you're only being detrimental to your mental health. Coping strategies, these are just ways to deal with stuff that you might come across. So, if you start to feel anxious all the time, practicing breathing techniques would be a coping strategy. Exercising for me personally is kind of a coping strategy. If I've had a bad day, I'd like to go exercise, and I feel like that helps improve my mental health. Joining groups. Um, ASF is somewhat of a group itself. Joining a group with like-minded people, it helps give you that social support that you need, and it also is just good to be around other people who have gone through something that you've gone through. Um, but there can also be other groups, church groups, book clubs. One I saw recently was like pickleball. These are all ideas of groups that you could join, and just being around other people is often very good for your mental health. And that ties in with leisure activities. So, stuff that I like to do for leisure, I like to sit outside and read, things like that. Those are good for your mental health. Journaling, this is a very big one. I haven't been able to do this personally very much, but just writing down your thoughts at the end of the day, write down what's on your mind. This is a way that you can get it all out, get out your thoughts on the table. That way you're not bottling up your emotions. And finally, I think a really important one, talking to a therapist. This is something that, kind of going back, talking about that stigma, people hear that and they think, oh, I don't want to talk to the therapist because I'm afraid of what people might think. But talking to a therapist can be extremely helpful. These people are specialized in helping individuals with mental health issues. So if you see it fit, talking to a therapist can be very beneficial for you. So, kind of to wrap up here today, all of these things that I talked about are important for mental health, but these are some of the strategies that you can take to help yourself and improve your own mental health. And finally, I kind of wanted to end with this. A way that you can kind of help others is just being an open ear, here at ASF, or, people at home. If you see somebody that looks like they may be exhibiting some of these signs and symptoms, try and talk to that person, ask them about their day, ask them if they're doing all right. We're all in this together. And in order to improve, those numbers we saw earlier, we kind of have to take a step forward and get more comfortable talking about these things. So thank you guys. I greatly appreciate you listening. I hope this was somewhat helpful. Um, Mental health is a very big topic, specifically within chronic stroke, because there's so many aspects of our lives that stroke impacts, um, not just during the time of the stroke, but also permanently. So, understanding the way that stroke impacts your mental health is important, and I hope you guys are able to take away from what I said today and use it in your lives moving forward. Thank you.